You're listening to the Talent Therapy Podcast. Here, you'll find discussions around recruiting trends and best practices with talent acquisition leaders in the biotechnology and pharmaceutical industries so that you and your team are informed and up to date in an ever-evolving space. And now, here's your host, Chris Tamburini.
All right, Miss Abbey Wolff, welcome to the Talent Therapy Podcast. It is a pleasure to have you. We have a history with this podcast, but we're finally here and we're able to have a good conversation. So I'm excited.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Yeah, we have quite the history. So I'm happy to be a part of this. I've been really impressed with all of the guests and all of the different topics that you covered. So hopefully people will be able to learn a little something new from me today too.
Absolutely. So I'd like to start this conversation the way that I start all of the conversations. And I want to learn, and the audience would like to learn how you got into talent acquisition and HR in the first place.
Yeah, so I'm a little different than I think a lot of the other guests that you've had on, right? I've heard a lot of people just kind of stumbled upon it. Mine was technically a combination of both, right? Like I went to school specifically for business, but with a concentration in HR. I wasn't sure exactly what I wanted to do under that umbrella. So I was really keen on getting a generalist type of role, but at the time I was graduating was during the period of like 2009, 2010, which, was super hard to get a job, especially as an entry level grad. So I kind of fell into recruiting, right? So that specifically was kind of a little accidental, slightly intentional, right? But kind of happenstance, I think, of the economy, because there was all sorts of agencies willing to hire totally green and inexperienced young people for nothing. And so, of course, that's kind of how I started. And in fact, I started as like an unpaid intern working in Chicago. And I worked alongside someone who I think was still to this day like one of the best mentors I ever had. She was a total like seasoned pro at just developing really deep connections. And I really learned the ropes from A to Z. And she made recruiting exciting for me, right? So having that experience right from the start just kind of enabled me to pursue that pretty intentionally. And I actually went on to work in TA and lead TA teams essentially for close to 13 years of my career. I just went over to the dark side recently. I've been in an HR leadership position with Servier Pharmaceuticals for the past year, which has been great because my role here has a really deep and focused lens on the talent acquisition piece as well. And I think that experience has translated really well.
Yeah. So, if I recall correctly, and I want to talk about that transition from TA to HR and how they're both related, how they're both different. But before I go into that, if I remember correctly, didn't you start off your career in sales? Didn't you start selling?
I did. That's a good point. So although I was, had the HR concentration with my major, I was still kind of dabbling with what I wanted to do under the business umbrella. And again, right, looking at the economy back then, you were not making $30 an hour as an intern, right? You were either making nothing or you got a stipend like based on whatever kind of commissions you brought in. So I actually did my first internship selling ads in university directories, which, as you can imagine, right, everyone was just dying to get in the essentially the white pages, right, of a college directory during that time. What was interesting about that though, they had like a totally like soup to nuts sales program, which again like translated really well into agency recruiting. So that was a key benefit. But going door to door to businesses all summer long, not that great. So I quickly learned that was probably not going to be for me, right? And that's like where recruiting kind of came into play, because I'm like, oh, it's kind of like the sales side of HR, right? So it's like I like this, but now this is like, okay, you're actually getting people, you're selling people jobs, like that's amazing, right? So it was obviously a much better, I hate to call people products, but it's a much better product, right? And it kind of fit more like under the like business umbrella that I was hoping for. But yeah, that was certainly an experience I'll never forget, and I'm glad I never had to do again. And to think about the fact that that was even something that was like tangible
Yeah.
is crazy.
Well,
But I have to say though, we were the pioneers of text marketing. Like that was like a product that like they launched, like this particular company launched that summer, and it was like so novel and so new where like companies could buy like whatever the service was to like text like advertisement. So we were a little ahead of the curve. Just gonna say I'm kind of a early innovator here.
so, I don't think you and I have actually gone deep in this conversation, but I think we actually have almost the same exact background because I also sold advertising space for a college publication, and they were just starting to get into like internet media as well. So
Mhm.
what was the name of the, if you can say it, what was the name of the company you
Oh,
were
I can say university directories.
Okay, so I think the guys that I worked for actually were a spin-off of the university directories, and they started their own business, which was called the Campus Special, and we were literally doing the same thing. So the publication was different in the fact that it came out in the form of like coupon books and
Yeah.
also like online media. So they were trying to be a little, I guess, different. But I'm 99% sure the guys came from the university directory, and we were doing the same thing. We were walking into pizza places,
Yep.
salons, selling door to door, getting brutally rejected on a daily basis. But it was an awesome experience. And like you, when I found out that, oh, I can do, sales or do customer service in more of a professional capacity, if you will. Nothing against
Right.
those roles, but you're like the product is just it's a little less salesy and it's a little bit more consultative. Um, I kind of fell right into it. So we have
And it's needed, right?
yeah,
It's something
yeah,
that's
yeah.
actually valuable. That was the one thing I learned, right? How important it is to actually get behind something you believe in,
Right, right. It's
right?
tough to be very passionate about advertising when you're
And something that you know gets very limited visibility,
yeah.
especially I went to school in the city, right? It was not a university town. So I think half the people like didn't even know what that was, right? Let alone the businesses really did not rely on that foot traffic necessarily, you know. So yeah, lots of really good lessons learned on how to like due
Yeah,
diligence around like how to really think about your opportunities and like what's going to lead you down the path of success.
totally, totally. Yeah, and I will say the sales training in those programs was really strong. So I got really great sales training experience.
Yeah, and look at you today. So, you know, you can attribute all of your success to the campus
Yeah, I'll
special.
have to give those guys
Here we
a
are.
shout out. I still know
Yeah,
the project.
shout out to campus sales.
Yeah, totally.
If anyone's listening, great place to
It,
start
it
out.
really is. It really is.
Forgot everything we just said.
Exactly. All right, so we're digressing. However, that kind of leads me to my next question, which is, your transition, right? So you spent a lot of time in TA, and then you consciously made a decision to go into HR. So I think the audience would probably want to know, and I'd want to know how you feel they're related and different, and what are the different nuances between kind of both avenues.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really, really great question. Yeah, it was interesting. I love talent acquisition. I think I'll always be a talent acquisition professional at heart, right? And that was something that was really important in whatever role that I took on next. I still was involved, right? I wasn't totally like decentralized out of that process, and I was still going to be able to influence, you know, very strategically, you know, how we were making hiring decisions, the type of people we were bringing in, you know, our philosophy, all of the strategic work around that. It was just really important that I wasn't going to completely back away from that. But, you know, I was telling you a bit earlier, you know, I'm a year in now and, you know, reflecting back, you know, on the past year, there wasn't much of a learning curve, to be honest, right? I think there was much less of a learning curve than I or, you know, anyone really imagined because talent acquisition, you know, is set up as a function where you're truly a consultant, a business partner, an advisor, right? To all of the aspects of people. You know, when you're bringing people into the organization, that's one of the most important pieces, I think, you know, of the employee life cycle, bringing in the right people in the right roles. And also really understanding, you know, what motivates people. You know, you get to see the side of why people want to leave companies, why they stay at companies, you know, what they're looking for out of employers and what they're looking for out of their employee experience. And I think that's been able to serve me really well in my role as HRBP, really having those deep, rich insights that you get, right? And that's actually one of the pieces I miss the most is talking to people externally, right? Learning about the market, right? Learning about, the current trends and really what's, making people tick and what's going to motivate them to think about new roles. So I still do my best to keep a pulse, on those pieces through, talking really closely with my TA colleagues and, reading a lot. But that is the one piece I miss is building those external connections and network. And of course, just being able to really learn more from even a business acumen perspective, what's going on, especially in our ever changing market. But yeah, I think overall, the past 3 years, I was leading talent acquisition functions, in which, I was with two startups. So, in both capacities, a bit different. One was really early on. The other one was, I would say, a bit more advanced. But, I was really building and evolving the TA structure. And that involved a lot of consultancy, a lot of advisement, right, on how, the employer needed to, what they needed to think about when it came to hiring, both from, how to actually build your organization efficiently, right? How to scope roles, what success would look like, and then, what kind of candidate they were really looking for, and then building the EVP around that as well for the, employees that we were looking to bring in. And I think those pieces really kind of served me in that business partner capacity, right, on both sides, because now I think I've been really able to see some, really tangible proof points of really kind of changing a bit of the paradigm of how we've thought about scaling our organization here at Servier, because we've gone through quite a bit of growth. And, we're encountering a few inflection points of, moving into commercialization with a new product, as well as, continuing to build and enrich our pipeline and really also building our brand as a place that people want to be. We've only been in the US for about 5 years. And, even prior to me joining this organization, I hadn't heard much about them. And really curating and designing what makes us unique and also building that internal value proposition. A lot of those really deep, rich insights on what kind of strategy we needed to think about that was going to resonate with both our internal employees and people wanting to join has certainly, I think, really helped shape, even a lot of the proof points around success that we've seen with engagement as a company overall. And of course, just looking at the, success of the people that we brought in over the past year. It was of course, a team effort, right, with my really great TA colleagues. But, that's been a part that I think, at least as far as the advisory piece, with some of my leaders, I think I've really been able to make an impact. And that was really because of my background in talent acquisition. So I think that that's really served me well. And I think that's really helped alleviate, a learning curve, from that perspective, just because of my engagement and how I really positioned myself as a true partner to the business throughout most of my career in the capacities that I was working in.
No, that makes a ton of sense. That makes me think about how the employer value proposition aligns with candidate motivations, right? And I think you have seen a lot of different aspects of that, and it sounds like part of what you're currently doing is aligning an employer value proposition with candidate motivations. And so I think the question is how you are seeing candidate motivations right now in this market and how you've been able to help align that EVP with those candidate motivations.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And actually plays into one of the reasons why I did want to move into more of a business partner role, because just purely, right, I see talent development as being such a critical element. And I always really was thinking about that as I was bringing, new employees into the organization. I was thinking not only, okay, right fit for right now, but I was thinking about their development, right? And really coaching and educating on, how their new manager really could facilitate that from day one. And that was something that was really important to me. And I see that being more important than ever right now, right? Our retention rates are, less than half of what they were this time last year. And that is indicative of some of the market conditions. We are getting the sense that, our employers are definitely looking inward for advancement versus outward, right? For the most part, externally, which is great. But how do we capitalize on that, right? And that's been a key piece of our people strategy this year is focusing on development. So we rolled out individual development plans, and we did a few different cohorts on the enablement piece and training because we saw that as being such a critical element of success, right? Because development can be this like very like nebulous thing, right? And I think oftentimes, people assume it's the responsibility of their manager and then vice versa. And then that's where our expectations, I think, can kind of get lost in translation. So, looking at how we wanted to set this up, we really wanted to put employees in the driver's seat of this, but give them the tools and the training of how to really think about it in a way that was tangible and measurable, right? And realistic and feasible based on where they were in their role. So we designed numerous trainings for them, both on how to really think about it. We designed a template to structure the conversation between them and their manager to make it, you know, really effective, and that way it made it a lot easier for both the manager and then us from HR to support because we had really, tangible data to work with around what this employee was looking for and what the plan was. And that was very successful. We also train managers and we're continuing to do ongoing training on how they can really support employees, right? Both through, we looked at it at the 70-20-10 model, right? So 70% of that would be on the job. So looking for stretch opportunities and different challenging assignments, 20% through the social aspect in which we've tried to really connect people, cross functionally as well as in their function, for mentorship, coaching. And then the 10% is more formal, right? So that's been a big focus of us too, is both designing in-house, various tools and training to facilitate that, but also looking externally of where we can really, invest to make the biggest impact to develop people and also upskill them, right, for the future, which is mutually beneficial. And then we also did launch a talent review and succession planning initiative this year as well, which is the first time we've really done something like this that's intentional at really identifying, our top talents within the organization. And our goal is, of course, to continue to invest in, specific training, both that, we really need from a leadership behavioral perspective as our company grows and scales, but also really investing in them to continue to keep them challenged and motivated. And then think about talent, like a bunch of talent as enterprise talent, even beyond their function, which can be certainly a mindset shift. But we're looking to get really creative to see, where people may be fungible across the organization, across different functions, which will be really interesting to really kind of measure the success of this, right? And ultimately what that looks like. But, just looking at some of the results that we've seen, we do Gallup as our kind of survey of choice, and that's rolled down actually from our global parent company in France. So it's a global tool. So we're a bit limited with what we can index, but what we have seen of all of the fields really where we were measuring engagement as it related to development, feeling challenged, feeling like there were opportunities within the company. We saw some significant increases in those particular scores this year, and I think that also correlates into our retention of our top talent, which right now attrition in that particular area is really low. So we'll continue to iterate on that this coming year. But, just looking at, some data points and just looking even at the market, I think we have a real opportunity to continue to facilitate both growth and development and also utilize our bench of talent, right, for opportunities. And, just thinking from like my talent acquisition lens, I come from, the position I've always encouraged my leaders to really think about promoting within, especially for senior level roles, right? Creating that talent pipeline internally so that way you can promote versus hiring externally whenever you have the opportunity, and then you're kind of filling your funnel, right, with more junior talent that you can continue to develop and really kind of create that ecosystem. And so far that's been working well for us, and we'll continue to, like I said, iterate on that as well as we identify really kind of some of the skills that we need to develop for the future.
So I guess a couple of things are coming to mind as you're talking. Number one, I think it's fantastic that you guys have a developmental plan because I do think that a lot of employees value that and they want to be developed. But I'm gonna take a sidestep and look at the other end of that. Do you ever fear, or do you ever get, and this is a time to be totally honest, like some pushback as to be like, okay, this is a overly bureaucratic, overly structured, obligatory process that we're being asked to do as either hiring managers or leaders, or as a junior employee who maybe they don't feel like they want to go through all these processes to be developed. They just want to put their heads down and work. And hiring managers are like, listen, maybe I'll develop people who I feel who are top performers. Why do we need to go through all these processes? And so I can see both sides of it, but I'm just curious, and again, I'm playing devil's
Mhm.
advocate here intentionally. Do you have you gotten any pushback about like having an overly developed developmental process, or is it?
Yeah.
I'm just curious.
No, that's a good question, right? Because I don't believe in process for process, right?
Yeah,
So this is what we were hearing. This is what we were hearing. This is what we were seeing, that development was a black box. Managers felt like that they didn't know really, how to go about it, right? Employees also didn't really know what was available to them. So we wanted to make development overall more equitable. And, the way that we really, I would say, implemented this was putting employees at in the driver's seat of this. So this is employee driven, right? So they're the ones taking the initiative to really do the thought work and really, outline what interests them, and create even a rough draft of a plan. And they're the ones that are taking the initiative to schedule that development conversation with their managers. So you're right. If someone's perfectly happy and content, and they're not necessarily yearning for the same type of structured development or support in that way, that's perfectly fine. But what we've seen the majority of the organization is, and even feedback that we've heard is from our employees, that they've been at other companies who've done something similar, and it just felt like a check the box exercise. And
yeah,
here they felt like we were really committed because of all the training and just the different support that we were offering, facilitating the employees on how to go about it, but also the managers. It gave them guidance. It takes out the guesswork. And I think that sometimes can be the biggest barrier, right? I've managed people before, you've managed people. I think the hardest part is you see potential in someone, right? And you may see opportunities for them to develop, but they don't want it and they can't articulate exactly what it is, right? And that's the biggest struggle. So, by doing this, you give people the opportunity to really give them a framework of where to even start, a starting point, right? And likewise, it informs the managers and it really helps them. It helps just clear the way for them to be able to support that and support it specifically in ways that interest people. And you made a point, right? Maybe people aren't on this rocket ship, right? Where they want to just continue to rise within the organization. And that was also a key message when we rolled this out is, this isn't a blueprint for promotion, right? This isn't a distinct roadmap. Of course, as you continue to develop, that will only help facilitate your growth within the company. But, we really focused on, let's think about how we can even grow laterally, right? This kind of opens a door to get exposure perhaps to other departments cross functionally, right, etc. So it wasn't necessarily this like clear map for people that were destined to shoot up the ladder to VP. We really wanted to also make it very equitable and approachable for those people that are quite comfortable, right, but yet may want to experience new challenges. And I think that's something that is a kind of a shift in mindset of what growth looks like, right? So that was also something that it's a great starting point for us. And we're going to continue to identify ways to develop and grow people laterally, just outside kind of this like vertical growth channel.
love it, love it. No, I love how, I guess, open and flexible that model seems, because you're right. I've been part of organizations where maybe growth and development was pushed too much to individuals who maybe weren't looking for it, and it just
Exactly.
created this unnecessary amount of energy, as well as um, you losing out on people who I think were really good at what they did, but they weren't looking for certain developmental paths. They wanted to stay in their area and excel in that area, but not have to go in different direction for the sake of going in a different direction.
Yeah,
So
exactly. And that's why we've kind of thought about it as, let's think about it as two different programs in a sense, right?
yeah,
Individual development plans are something we rolled out to everyone, right? So that's something accessible and that, no one's excluded from. Everyone has an opportunity to develop in the ways that, you know, they're passionate and motivated towards. And then we have this other cohort that you can consider like both a high potential, high performing cohort, right? Of exactly the phenotype that you just mentioned. And that's where we're looking to make, those additional investments to really propel their growth in, very specific ways. So it's very kind of democratized. There's something for everyone, right? Which I think it is great, right? That's something that I've seen that's truly a differentiating factor. I've worked at big companies prior to my startup career, and it felt like development was a black box, right? You always knew that there was like this like the high potential development plan like happening in the background, but like you didn't know like what qualified you for that or what have you too, right? And we also want to be, pretty transparent about that, right? And let people know that everyone has an opportunity, right, to be considered, a top talent, right? It's just, we have certain standards as far as, leadership behaviors that are exhibited on the job, how you're performing, etc. Right? So I think it's really kind of eliminated the kind of mystery behind that and feels like a fair employee experience, I think, which is also really important, right? That we're willing to invest and support everyone, but tailoring it in different ways depending on people's motivations and just their aspirations overall. I think that's a really important piece to consider that you mentioned.
totally. I love it. I love it. Let me shift gears here for a minute. When it comes to your current role and your current position being an HR business partner, and when you're negotiating with a candidate to onboard a new candidate, not promote a candidate within, but you're taking in someone
Mhm.
from the outside, and an offer is out or there's a negotiation in process, have to imagine that your role right now has some different nuances than your role as a TA function. And so I'd be curious to hear what you're seeing when it comes to negotiating with candidates and what you feel and also the organization feels, the decision makers who are essentially signing off on those offers, what is important to them.
Sure, I think that's a great question. And that's something I can probably speak to a bit of a different approach to, right? And I really kind of changed my perspective on this when I was with my last company, TCR Squared. We were really rooted in the ethos of, creating a valuable employee experience right from the start. And most importantly, being competitive and fair and having people join the organization with that sentiment. So we wouldn't negotiate, right? We look at the data, we triangulate, multiple data points, whether it's, through Radford, our own market intelligence, internal equity, and really lead with our best foot forward, right? Make them the offer that they should get, right? It eliminates so much wasted time and effort that both parties spend going back and forth, right? And you can often lose excitement. I mean, I've been on that the other side, right? Where I was super excited about the role. I felt really positive about my interactions with the hiring team. I saw myself there, no question. And then, they came out with an offer much lower than what I anticipated. And it really can take the wind out of your sails and it can kind of give you the impression, will this be my experience? How do I know that they're treating me fairly and that I'm going to be compensated competitively through my, employment with this company? And it's always been in the back of my mind, oh, did I push hard enough on that? Right. I really want to join this organization. So I don't want to push too hard, right? Where they feel like I'm being demanding or pushy. And, I mean, I'm speaking as a woman and there's endless data around, that women don't negotiate as hard as men, right? They don't have the confidence, it's perceived differently, all of those considerations. So, that's where I am strongly rooted in the approach of just offering people what they deserve, right? So I do have to do a bit of coaching, and advising with some of my business leaders who still have the more traditional approach of, well, let's start here, right? Let's try here and see. Well, I explain to them why, right? That's not always the best way. Even sometimes when the data comes back and says, we need to be compensating, XYZ above where we started, sometimes they're shocked and uncomfortable with that, right? Even though the candidates' expectations are much lower. And what I say is, no, this is the beginning of their employee journey with us, right? And that initial impression from the first 90 days makes such a huge impact. So let's exceed their expectations, right? And let's pay them what's competitive and what's fair, and that really starts the whole journey off in a really positive way. And I think it really engages them. They feel good coming in. They know that you're going to be treating them fairly. And that's something that is always really important to me. And everything I think about that we do is that you're fair, right? Most importantly. And we continue as well, even like you said, internally, to ensure that we're keeping up with the market. We've had to make adjustments on certain areas of leveling and compensation where, just it fell behind. It fell behind where the market is, right? So even without people asking, we've taken the opportunity to raise them up and do what is right? Because that is, again, I think that's always kind of the root of my personal ethos and how I act and lead, in my role. And that's, I think it's a mindset shift. I was talking to you just kind of off the cuff that earlier, but I think wage transparency is going to force a lot of employers in this direction as well, right? When, potential new hires have access to see the range, they can really accurately, with hard data and hard facts say, where they should be coming in. So I think it's going to change the paradigm quite a bit. And employers are going to have to be solidly rooted in why they're coming out with the offer that they are. And like, I mentioned to you, like, let's look at even like the car buying, you know, industry. Like, look at that model. Like, just think about like how painful that was. And like everyone was like, oh, I have to buy a car, right? It's this like terrible back and forth. You never walked away feeling like you got the best deal and you were always leaving something on the table. I would equate that to the offer process, and you can look at a few other companies that have like completely changed their model, and it's like what you see is what you get, right? And those have really taken off for good reason. It's about the experience.
Yeah, no, that's a big one. I mean, the car thing is interesting, right? Yeah, the in negotiating in general is a painful experience. Most people don't like it. Some people love it, but most people don't like it. And for that kind of to be taken out of the equation and coming through with a very sound market driven offer right from the get go
Yeah.
that is going to meet or exceed the expectations of a candidate, it says a lot because I've been and you've been in situations as you talked about where you go through this whole process, candidates excited, the hiring team's excited, and then an offer comes through and it's well under expectations and it totally just blows up the entire process. And now even if a better offer were to come out as like a counter offer, a few days later, there's already that feeling embedded in
Yep.
that person that this maybe isn't as exciting as I thought. And there's
Yeah.
a stain there, if you will. So
Yeah, they lose confidence in your
yeah,
process,
yeah.
right? They lose confidence in the business process, the HR process, right? Your advocacy of them, I
Hmm.
think is a big one, right? And it just the time suck. Think about that, right? It can delay an acceptance by 2 weeks or more, right? I've seen that happen
Hmm.
before, and you just think about the valuation of time on both sides, and you can almost like create the fill the gap of the delta just with that,
Yeah.
right? Especially if you've senior level people working on it. So I just think it's completely inefficient and it's really detrimental to the candidate experience and then their in turn the employee experience. So I'm hoping to see more progress there, right? I know people think differently about that and that's okay, but this is just an approach that has really served me well.
Yeah. No, you're seeing it more. You're seeing like, and I don't think it's become law yet, but I think in California it might be, but in Massachusetts, I don't know that it is yet. But you're seeing
It's coming.
comp
We're
packages.
preparing
Yeah,
for it. Yeah, I
you
mean, it
see
will
it.
be here within a couple of years, right? We typically will follow suit to states like New York, California,
Yep.
right? So yeah, within the next 2 years, we're already preparing. Well, and think about it, even if ideally like you want to hire a role in Boston, right? But you are opening up remote, you still have to post, right? So it's like slowly but surely getting there. So that will certainly, I think, uptick the need to be a lot more just transparent and straightforward with compensation from the start, which will be good for everyone.
Agreed. Agreed. Okay. So another question for you. So when you're looking at the future of the market, everyone knows where the market is right now. We've talked about that ad nauseum. We're not going to talk about it today. But I'm curious to hear about your perspective based on what you're seeing at a larger to stabler company than is more traditional to what's going on in Boston, right? In Boston, it's primarily made up of small to mid-sized companies. Your organization is a little bit larger, a little bit more stable, has an international presence. So what is your future vision of where the market is going from an overall perspective and then from a talent perspective?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I see it from a few points. I think, I specifically, I loved working at startups. I absolutely will do that again at some point in my career, no question. I just found the right place for me right now was, Survey, given where they were from, a size perspective. We're a mid-sized company. I have global experience in my past, right? So that was really something that I wanted again, in my next role after I left TCR squared. And then just given the work, right, we're moving, an asset for glioma that with an IDH mutation, there hasn't been a treatment for this in over 20 years. So it's truly groundbreaking, right? So when I looked at the pipeline, it was very enticing to me. And just for, anyone that doesn't know much about Survey, we acquired Agios Oncology 2 years ago. Which really fueled both our research presence in Boston, but also brought two, very successful assets into the company. So, looking forward, I think our biggest competition is still small bio. I'm talking to my friends who work even at some at stealth mode companies, and that particular segment of biotech is still growing, right? They're newly funded. Obviously, they're still kind of working through, proof of concept. There still is, they're very aspirational, but they're still, able to, proceed forward, I think, in other companies that, are at the clinical stages and they're just maybe not seeing the same levels of success that they hope for, right? So I think, we'll still continue to see that to be our biggest competition. I think that's a segment that's still relatively healthy. And I think there's a couple triggers, right? There is really good science still out there in companies. We've been very public about the fact we want to do another acquisition, right? We want to acquire kind of a mid to later stage new molecular entity at some point, as do other companies, mid to big size pharma. They really want to buy versus build. So I think you'll start to see an uptick in M&A activity, which will then drive money back in to the biotech sector overall. So it's kind of just a waiting game.
Yeah.
It really is. I think after JP Morgan next year, you'll probably see a few really big announcements just from what I know is going on in the market, right? So it's kind of just waiting for that stage gate, right,
Yeah.
to happen and the floodgate, because it's all systematic. We see it, right? So, in essence, what I'm saying is you can't take these moments are fleeting. You can't take advantage of, when things are going well, right? You have to always be really forward thinking. And so, that's where my mind's at. How do we continue to retain people? And here's the thing, right? When you're at these inflection points, especially, at times when, the spotlight shifts. I've been in organizations, the spotlight shifts then from research into manufacturing or into commercialization. Those are really big pieces that you have to consider, right? And there's just specific phenotypes of people that want to go and do it again at an earlier stage company, and you have to be okay for that. You just have to be prepared, right? You have to be prepared. That's why the development is so important. Succession planning is so important, right? So you have fungible resources to help really support that in the event that happens, right? And we really want to be supportive of people, doing what they, feel best doing. But it's definitely something that I'm thinking about, certainly. But it's also just continuing to curate the value proposition of why here, right? We have a lot of really big things going. Giving people the visibility, exposure, giving them those aspects that they would get at the biotech, but with a bit more security, right? We're actually funded by a French foundation, right? So we aren't at the mercy of shareholders, which is great. But there is always the allure still of that, that lotto ticket with equity that people will go after, right? So it's just that balance, but you need to just try to stay ahead of the curve and, prepare, I think, but also just continue to try to motivate people and engage them, is something that I'm really thinking about.
Love that insight and that perspective. I think it's very well thought out, and clearly it comes from some good experience and exposure on your end. So I tend to agree, but I do like your perspective on the future, or the recent, or the near future rather. Last question for you, Miss Abbey. If you were to give, well, actually before that, is there anything else that's on your mind that you want to talk about?
No, I just think I'm glad that I finally made it on the pod.
Yeah.
So this has been fun. And I also want to encourage TA professionals, the HR business partner role is not so bad. And I think it actually helps give really great perspective to the role,
Yeah.
right? So I've even been talking, I mean, Chris and I, we know a lot of the same people just from being in the business, right? So I'm always trying to give encouragement because I think it's all really helpful, right? To kind of see like the full, scope and just the full kind of, journey of the employee experience, and I'm like, you can always go back to TA if that's something that, you're passionate about. But it's been a really, really great experience so far.
Yeah. Well, you actually answered the question I was about to ask you, which is, what advice would you give someone who's looking to either enter the TA space or the HR
Yeah.
space? And you just kind of answered that. So I don't even have to ask you,
Yeah,
unless there's
well,
anything else you want to add.
yeah, no, a couple other pieces, right? When I think about what has served me well, I think being a problem solver is really important, a really important skill set to have, right? So if you're someone that does not run away from challenges and you're like, yes, let me help solve this, right? This is definitely the right place for you. Also, curiosity and always being just generally curious about the business, right? I think that's been something that has set me and other, former colleagues of mine really apart, is really just applying, a strong business lens to situations and really coming to the table with some really thoughtful insights, right? So I do a ton of reading. I go to a ton of networking events, right? And in the Boston market, I think that's something that can't be understated, is the network aspect of things. And there's so many meetup groups, right? I'll just give Mass Bio HR Roundtable a plug, because I'll be actually serving as one of the co-chairs starting next year. So
Nice.
for everyone working in biopharma, please come. It's really great actually to learn from everyone from small to medium to big bio. And we have a few really interesting agenda topics on the table, including AI, which, I know I'm really keen to learn a lot more about. So maybe we can have a return pod visit, once we kind of test and trial some of this stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think the networking piece, both from just potential candidates to others in our field, because I'm constantly calling people for advice and insights. I call you all the time. I text you all the time, right? What are you seeing? Same
Yeah.
with, right? So I'm loving like the open source aspect of this particular, the HR function overall, but even just this like ecosystem that we have here in Boston, which is why relationship building and connection is really important.
Totally. I mean, I couldn't agree with that sentiment more. Awesome. Well, you've been instrumental in the development of this podcast without anyone else knowing it. You have been. And so I'm happy we're finally able to record here and share your insights and your perspectives with the community. So thank you very much,
Great.
Ms. Abbey.
It's been fun. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Talent Therapy Podcast with Chris Tamburini. This show is for entertainment purposes only and is copywritten by Rana and Vance, LLC.